The sun had vanished beyond the horizon. The sea lay still and silent. And upon its glassy surface, a lone man drifted on a fragile raft. But this was no lost soul, this was a legend in search of home, Odysseus, hero of Ithaca. After 10 years of war beneath the walls of Troy and another 10 years wandering the wrathful seas, he now entered the fateful final chapter of his journey. For 7 long years, Odysseus was held captive on the island of the enchantress Calypso. She loved him with a fiery passion and promised him immortality, if only he would stay forever. But his heart belonged to Ithaca, to the wife and son awaiting his return, to a kingdom withering in the absence of its king. At last, Zeus intervened. He sent Hermes to command Calypso to let Odysseus go. With sorrow in her eyes and heartbreak in her voice, she agreed. She helped him build a raft, provided food, and watched in silence as the man she loved vanished into the endless blue. She knew, her love would never be enough to anchor a hero like him. But the sea held no mercy. Poseidon, still seething with rage over the blinding of his son, the Cyclops, unleashed a storm to destroy the raft. As the waves crashed and the skies roared, Odysseus was hurled into the depths. Yet fate intervened once more. Ino, the sea goddess, took pity on him, casting him a magical veil to keep him afloat. Once again, the man who defied gods and monsters clung to life, driven by the pull of home. Washed ashore on the land of Phaeacia, Odysseus lay exhausted, his strength drained by the sea. By fate's gentle hand, Princess Nausicaa found him and brought the weary hero to the palace of her father, King Alcinous. There, for the first time in 10 long years of wandering, Odysseus told his full tale, of storms and monsters, of temptation and sorrow, of a journey shaped by gods and loss. Moved by his words and awed by his resilience, King Alcinous offered him a gift of mercy and honor, a ship, swift and silent, to carry the hero home under cover of night. After 10 years of brutal war beneath the towering walls of Troy, and another 10 years adrift across the unforgiving sea, Odysseus, the long-lost king of Ithaca, finally returned to his homeland. But his return was not greeted with fanfare or glory. There was no golden chariot, no songs of victory. He arrived in secret, cloaked in silence, bearing not the crown of a king, but the disguise of a beggar. He had come not to be celebrated, but to reclaim all that was taken from him. Ithaca was no longer the kingdom he had left behind. In the decades of his absence, decay had seeped into the very heart of his palace. Dozens of arrogant suitors had descended upon the royal halls, men who gorged themselves on royal feasts, who treated the queen as a prize to be won, and the throne as spoils of a lost king. Day by day, they tightened their grip, believing Odysseus to be long dead, forgotten, lost to the sea. Yet Penelope, the queen of unmatched wisdom and unwavering faith, had not surrendered. For 20 years, she held on to hope with the strength of a warrior's soul. To fend off the suitors, she devised a clever ruse, promising to choose a husband once she finished weaving a shroud for Odysseus's father. But each night, in secret, she unraveled what she had woven by day, delaying the inevitable and holding the kingdom together with little more than her courage and her wit. Guided by the goddess Athena, Odysseus set foot once more on Ithacan soil. In disguise as a weathered beggar, he entered his own palace unrecognized. No one suspected the truth, not the suitors, not the servants, not even his closest kin. But there was one who knew him. Argos, his faithful old dog, now frail and nearly blind, stirred from his place at the gate. With the last of his strength, Argos wagged his tail at the scent of his master. In a moment of quiet, loyal recognition, the dog let go, his life ending not in sorrow, but in peace. Odysseus shed silent tears, for the friend who had waited for him until the very end. Still, he said nothing. He waited. Patiently. Carefully. Until the moment was right. Seeing the rising tension, Penelope, torn by sorrow and the growing threat of the suitors, declared a final challenge. She would marry the man who could string the great bow of Odysseus and shoot a single arrow clean through 12 axe heads. A task only the true king had ever performed. The suitors jeered, each certain of his own victory. But one by one, they failed. No hand among them had the strength or the grace to bend the weapon of a hero. Laughter turned to silence. Pride to unease. Then, the beggar stepped forward. The hall erupted in mockery. Yet all eyes watched as he took the bow, his grip firm, his stance steady. In a single motion, he strung it with effortless ease. And then, he drew the string back and loosed the arrow. It flew like fate itself, clean, straight, unstoppable, piercing all 12 axe heads with perfect precision. The hall froze. Time held its breath. And then he stood. The disguise fell away. The beggar vanished. Before them stood Odysseus, king, warrior, husband, father. No longer lost, no longer wandering. Returned not to plead, but to judge. The time for mourning was over. The time for justice had begun. Without giving his enemies a moment to breathe, Odysseus rose from silence and let destiny fly. The arrow struck Antinous, the arrogant leader of the suitors, just as he tilted his cup to drink. The goblet shattered in his hand, crimson wine mingling with blood as his body collapsed to the marble floor. A stunned hush swept the great hall. Laughter died. Faces turned pale. What had begun as a feast ended in the birth of a reckoning. Then the storm broke loose. With his son Telemachus at his side, and the two loyal servants, Eumaeus the swineherd and Philoetius the cowherd, Odysseus barred the doors of his own palace, sealing it like a tomb. No one would escape. This was no longer a home, but a battleground of justice. The suitors rose, shouting in confusion, grabbing swords and shields, but none were faster than the wrath of a king betrayed. One arrow after another found its mark. The cries of pride turned to screams of fear. Blood splashed across columns and tapestries. Marble floors, once white and noble, were painted red with the downfall of the false. To those who dropped their weapons and begged for mercy, Odysseus offered no words, only a stare colder than steel. His silence thundered louder than any battle cry. This was not the rage of a warrior, it was the sentence of a judge. One forged by 20 years of loss. The suitors, once so bold, now crawled like shadows toward corners that would not save them. Their fate had been written the moment they stepped into his home uninvited. One by one, they fell, undone not by armies, but by a father, a husband, a king reclaiming his soul. But the reckoning was not yet complete. When the final suitor lay still, Odysseus did not rest. He turned to those who had betrayed him from within, household servants who had laughed with the enemy, maids who had shared the enemy's bed, those who had turned their loyalty into currency. He demanded their names. Justice, now cold and quiet, extended to every corner of the palace. There was no shouting. No weapons drawn. Only ropes, and silence. The guilty were led out into the courtyard, where they met their end, not with fire or sword, but with the still judgment of a king returned. Their bodies hung beneath Ithaca's sky, a grim reminder that no betrayal is forgotten, and no crown is taken without consequence. Thus, the palace, once stained with indulgence and decay, was washed clean in blood and sorrow. Not in celebration, but in restoration. Not in vengeance alone, but in the name of justice, of memory, of home. And then, came Penelope. She had heard rumors, whispers of death, of a stranger who had risen as a king, but her heart could not believe. She ran through the corridors of the palace she once called home, and there, in the shattered remains of the great hall, she saw him. A man, worn by time, cloaked in shadow and silence, stood in the place where her husband once ruled. Was it truly him? Could the man she had mourned, dreamt of, waited for through storm and silence, truly stand before her now? Or was this a trick, a lie dressed in memory? She tested him. "Move our bed," she said, to see if the soul of the man matched the body that wore his shape. Odysseus froze. His eyes, once filled with fury, now shimmered with something deeper, recognition. "Our bed cannot be moved," he said softly. I carved it myself, from the trunk of a living olive tree. The roots still anchor it to the earth. You'd have to cut it down to move it. And in that moment, time stood still. The weight of 2 decades collapsed into a single breath. Penelope wept, not for grief, but for certainty. The man before her was no stranger. He was the tree, the storm, the silence, the song. He was Odysseus. They embraced, not as legends, but as people weathered by the gods. War, monsters, exile, temptation, none had destroyed what tethered them together. 20 years of longing, tested by fate itself, now ended not with triumph, but with tears. In that embrace, Ithaca was whole again. The journey of Odysseus was never just about crossing seas or outwitting monsters and gods, it was the eternal human longing to return home. In a world ruled by divine whims and tragic fate, Odysseus was deeply, unmistakably human. He lied, he failed, he let pride cloud his path, but he also loved, suffered, and fought with all he had to protect his family, his homeland, and his dignity. After 20 years of storms and struggle, he didn't return to rest, but to restore justice to a kingdom lost. In the blood of traitors, in the embrace of a loyal wife, in the tears shed for a grown son, Odysseus didn't just come home, he was reborn. Ithaca is no longer just an island, it is the symbol of endurance, of loyalty, of a hope that never dies. And Odysseus, the man who defied gods to return, will forever be the embodiment of courage, wisdom, and the strength to be human. And you, who've heard his story, are you ready to cross the storms of your own life, to come home to yourself?